The following featured presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. My name is Melissa Miller. I'm one of your hosts. I am a science writer and a contributor to Star Wars Insider magazine.
And I'm your other host, James Floyd. I am a freelance writer for StarWars.com and Star Wars Insider Print Magazine. We were going to present to you our celebration panel, Andor, the Empire and a History of Resistance. Unfortunately, the Empire intervened and made it impossible for us to record. No, actually, it was not recorded, unfortunately. But we have brought back most of the original panel, and we're going to redo it for you just for Star Warsologies. If you do check out the YouTube version, we'll have the visuals, the slides that we occasionally reference as we go on through the episode. Also a disclaimer, we do talk about resistance and rebellion, and that includes discussions of people committing violence. We do not advocate committing violence except maybe against fascists.
Punch fascists. Enjoy.
Welcome, everyone, to Andor, the Empire and a History of Resistance. I am your moderator, James Floyd, and I will have our other panelists introduce themselves. Chris.
Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Kempshall. I'm a historian and kind of author, and in regards to Star Wars, I've written two books, one of which is The History and Politics of Star Wars, Death Stars and Democracy, which fairly self-explanatory, kind of explores the way that Star Wars portrays history and real-world politics. And the other one is a licensed book with DK called Star Wars: Battles That Changed the Galaxy.
So hi, I'm Becca Harrison. I am a film historian and I am the author of the BFI Film Classics book, The Empire Strikes Back, which does a deep dive into the history of the production and reception of that film. And I'm currently writing another book about Star Wars titled TBC, but I do lots of research around marginalized histories of Star Wars fans and perspectives. So I've looked at gender representation in the franchise, queer aesthetics in The Empire Strikes Back, and currently looking into the environmental impact of prop and costume making for the Star Wars films.
Yeah, hi, I'm Oli Mould. I'm a professor of human geography at Royal Holloway, University of London. I study things such as urban activism, climate activism as well, more recently looking at some of the ways in which tactics are used by particular protest groups to get what they need. I've written a few things about Star Wars, no books or anything, but a few blog posts, but mainly from the position of a fan. So I'm an academic first, I guess, but a Star Wars fan very close second.
Hello, my name is Jake Rowlett. I'm a fourth year PhD student in the Joint Doctoral Geography program between San Diego State University and University of California, Santa Barbara. My dissertation research is all about the impact of Star Wars on real spaces. So like through a tourism and identity perspective, and from a more Star Wars-y point of view, I just worked with a great team over this past weekend to pull off the May the 4th Sci-Fi Film Festival in Portmagee, Ireland. It's the first time we had a film festival component to that local Portmagee festival. So yeah, that was been a great new little Star Wars addition to my repertoire.
And our final panelist from Celebration, Professor Manuel Barcia, is unfortunately unable to join us today, but we will do our best to reiterate his main talking points. I guess the first question that we have is, why resist and rebel? Velsartha says everyone has their own rebellion. What are the differences between those two, and what's the why behind those?
I think in terms of the differences between resistance and rebellion, those are really interesting to me. It's something I think about in my own work and my own activism quite a lot. And for me, it comes down to a sense of where you are in relation to the thing that you're opposed to. So resistance feels more like something where you are asserting boundaries, where you're putting in place something that says, like, you don't get to cross this line. This is the absolute sort of limit of my boundary. Whereas rebellion feels more like an incursion into enemy territory. And it's interesting to me that that's not a distinction that gets made in Star Wars. They're used quite interchangeably, even though there are different definitions of these words, multiple definitions of each of the words. But I mean, certainly all the way through the films, the TV shows, I mean, you have to resist and you have to rebel to survive. It's a really fundamental thing that you have to do in order to protect yourself, to protect your loved ones, your community, your way of life. You simply cannot survive under the kind of oppression that many of the communities and planets are experiencing in that galaxy without it.
Yeah, so I would jump in there as well, and just to sort of build on that, to suggest that the why is really important there, because I think people who resist and rebel, coming from the research that I've done anyway, and the background of the history of resistance through the centuries, is that they are trying to create a world, or create an environment, a society, a culture even, which is different to the status quo, different to the one in which they are experiencing at the moment, which they perceive as unjust, unsustainable, unequal, whatever the sort of disadvantage is. So the why is they're trying to create, it crosses over with utopian studies and thinking about the horizons of utopia and people moving towards that. So the why is a really interesting point, because it's just a general sort of, or a fundamental dissatisfaction with current conditions of living. And so they partake in resistance activity or rebellious activity in order to change the structural systems of that status quo in order to make a better one. And that might be incrementally, it might be in one massive swoop in a revolution, but that's at its core, that's the why of that particular kind of question.
I think that's a really good point as well. You mentioned utopia and trying to make change, and a recurrent theme in Star Wars, as we all know, is hope. You know, as Rose Tico says, you know, you fight you save what you love rather than fight what you hate. And there is, a strange as it may seem, a degree of optimism, I think, to rebelling and to resistance, even when you're fighting something really violent in extreme conflict. It has to be about trying to make the world that you live in a better place.
When it comes to some of the difference between resistance and rebellion, I mean, if we take a kind of examine of our own kind of human past, you know, in the Second World War, it's the French resistance. It's not the French rebellion. You know, they're not playing around in France when they're trying to kind of check the Nazis. But resistance in that sense becomes try and stave off this for as long as possible until such a point comes when open rebellion becomes a possibility. But they're not trying to overthrow kind of Paris and kind of reclaim the whole countryside in one go. What they're trying to do is situation in check. And as Beck was saying earlier on, it's about drawing a line, you know, this far, no further at this point, whereas rebellion becomes probably more violent. You know, resistance can be quite petty, or kind of, you know, quite small things can be an act of resistance against, you know, a more powerful oppressor. And then when it comes to kind of why resist and why rebel, certainly in regards to kind of Andor, but also in other moments of Star Wars, what you often see is, and you see it in Rogue One, is people basically being put into a situation where they have to make a choice. You either submit or get crushed, or you make the active decision to resist or rebel. And yeah, George Lucas has kind of written about in regards to his kind of vision of the Rebel Alliance as that, you know, not making a decision is making a decision, you know, and, you know, that's been kind of as a phrase that already exists, you know, not making a decision is to side with the oppressor. So the kind of the follow-on question is, you know, what's taking everyone so long? Why is it, you know, why are some people reaching the point of resistance and rebellion quicker than other people? And there's a reading of Andor that it's a critique of humans, because there aren't many aliens in those prisons. There aren't many aliens in those kind of oppressive worlds. I don't reckon they're off having a great time. If they're not there, I imagine they're off having a much, much worse situation imposed upon them than the humans are. And they probably didn't need anybody to explain to them that those stormtrooper guys over there are probably bad. So their point of no return decision making came probably a lot earlier than some of the people in the galaxy, particularly some of the human people.
Yeah, Chris, that's a great point. I wanted to piggyback off of some of that stuff. I'm reminded of a quote that you mentioned when you were talking about how George Lucas talked about inactivity and stuff. And it's like, you could ignore politics, the politics will not ignore you, right? And that's an idea that you see a lot, especially in Andor. Like as soon as, like in this picture we're looking at right now, where as soon as he tries to go on summer vacation, everything goes totally south for him. But yeah, you were talking about, we're talking about resistance and rebellion, and this, I introduced other R words, you know, like reworking and resilience. And a lot of these words that can maybe predate or kind of work in harmony with the idea of resisting, of other people's strategies and what scale at which they're able to affect change, how that can kind of be leveled up or reworked by different oppressive regimes and stuff. But in the terms of Star Wars, it's weirdly, I mean, I'm just thinking about this right now, so anybody can disagree with me, but it almost feels like in the Star Wars world, rebellion is reserved almost for like a more organized, like things become rebellions when all of a sudden there's organizational structure around them, and it's resistance up until that point, which is why it's interesting, I think, in the sequel trilogy, you know, how it's called the Resistance, but then in Last Jedi, you get so many more references to, like, you know, calling each other rebels and rebel scum and all that kind of stuff. It's like as more as the open friction kind of gets out into the world and they feel more empowered, then they're almost able to graduate to rebellion, or at least in the Star Wars-y kind of sense of the words.
I like the idea that rebellions come with administrative. Like, as soon as human resources get involved, it becomes a rebellion.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, there definitely is some level of organization that happens when a rebellion. We can talk about kind of individual resistance, and certainly we see that kind of like with the French resistance, that even, you know, just a work slowdown or, you know, tying up the enemy's resources just so that they are getting bogged down so that they can't achieve their objectives on their own schedule. That's resistance. You're providing for that friction.
I was also thinking about it as just sort of becoming proprietary. You know, is there anything like it's the rebellion, right? Like, I feel like capital R, you know, the Rebel Alliance sort of thing in the original trilogy. And so maybe there's some leftover political, you know, connotations to that where, you know, the next generation, you know, either it's sacred or, you know, hated kind of thing. So you're just like, well, we'll just come up with a different word, you know, thinking about, like, we used to call it global warming. And then people who didn't believe in it got really pedantic about, well, not everything's warming, and so now we call it climate change. You know, it's like that you just kind of have to like pivot if things get too political almost.
That's a great point.
Okay, moving on to kind of the individual motivations. We have a lot of characters in Andor, and they all kind of come from different places, and they all a lot of them, you know, become part of a resistance, that they become rebels for lots of different reasons. So let's talk about some of those people.
And look at all those female characters. Woo! That was my big takeaway, honestly, from Andor, was like, hey, look at that. Diverse universe.
I mean, one of the things about the, I would say, relative diversity of women that we get relative to other Star Wars TV shows and films, it's amazing to see that there is diversity and of age. That was one of the things that really struck me, because so often we get very young women rebels. You know, Leia is 19, Jin is 19, Rey is around that age as well. Like, we get these really, really young women. Padme is 14 in the or meant to be 14 in the first film as a senator. So I was really struck by Maarva being this older woman. You know, she's been president of the Daughters of Ferrix. She's lived her life. She's an elder in a community where there don't seem to be many elder women. And that to me actually feels quite progressive, that she is the one that's kind of speaking and reaching out and cutting through to this whole community of people, and that they actually listen to her. Like, to actually listen to an older woman is a really quite remarkable thing, and it not only in this universe, but in society more generally, which is deeply unfortunate. But the other, I mean, I was trying to think of other examples of that, because I mean, Mon Mothma seems like the most kind of matriarchal figure, perhaps, but she's not really old by any stretch of the imagination. Beru, we hardly get any of her at all. So yeah, I mean, that for me was a really meaningful choice and decision that they made, and I think a really powerful one.
My name is Maarva Karasi Andor. I'm honored to stand before you. I'm honored to be a daughter of Ferrix, and honored to be worthy of the stone. A stranger. Feel as if I can see you. I always wanted to be lifted. I was always eager, always waiting to be inspired. I remember every time it happened, every time the dead lifted me with their truth. And now I'm dead. And I yearn to lift you. I want Ferrix to continue. In my waning hours, that's what comforts me most. But I fear for you. We've been sleeping. We took their money and ignored them. We kept their engines churning, and the moment they pulled away, we forgot them. But we were sleeping. I've been sleeping. I've been turning away from a truth I wanted not to face. There is a darkness reaching like rust into everything around us. We let it grow, and now it's here. The Empire is a disease that thrives in darkness. It is never more alive than when we sleep. It's easy for the dead to tell you to fight. And maybe it's true, maybe fighting's useless. But I'll tell you this. If I could do it again, I'd wake up early and be fighting these bastards from the start. Fight the Empire!
There's something I really like in regards to that point, Becca, of Marva as the transmitter of wisdom and experience. You know, she doesn't need to teach anybody on Ferrix how to throw a Molotov cocktail at Imperials. They're gonna figure that out for themselves. But what we get from her backstory is she didn't like the Galactic Republic beforehand. She wasn't like hard school, fantastic, bring on the Galactic Republic or bring on the Separatists or anything like that. What she's trying to impart to everybody is these are the things you're going to need to know, or why you should throw that Molotov cocktail, or what's going to happen after you've done it. You know, the lessons of the past that are going to be useful for you when the time comes that, you know, it's going to be petrol bombs, it's going to be braining fascists with bricks, it's going to be these things. And I can't do that for you, although I'd very much like to, but I can tell you some of the things you're going to need to know when you decide to do that. And I thought that was fantastic, this kind of transference of historic memory to angry younger people who know that they're angry but don't necessarily know what the road ahead looks like if this is what they decide to do.
I think it's because I've been thinking about Star Wars and its connections with, you know, real life military contracts and the sometimes slightly dubious relationships that exist between the film industry and the military. So I've been thinking about The Force Awakens being filmed on Greenham Common, which, for people not familiar with British military history, Greenham Common was the site of I think, almost 20-year protest when the government agreed to house US nuclear missiles at that base. And it was a group of women that marched, I think some of them from Wales across England. They went to Greenham and they stayed there. They set up a camp and that's where they lived for 19 years between, I think, around 80 or 81. And I think 2000, it was the camp finally was disbanded. Very few of those women's names are known. They're not kind of culturally significant individual figures. But they had this huge impact on news cycles, military history, on the decisions that the government were making. You know, they made a really, really big difference. So I've been thinking about Marva quite a lot through that lens, as someone who we see in this snapshot kind of moment of time. And she has this massive impact. And she's come out of this space of kind of politicized women. And then she disappears into the ether, and then her name is not mentioned again all the way through the rest of the Star Wars canon, at least on screen. So yeah, I think it's just a really powerful representation of someone who has that moment, but isn't like an individual hero, but does affect a huge amount of change.
I think it's interesting that Marva is of her family, and Marva's the first to hit that line and decide, no more, and I'm going to stay here on Ferrix because I believe in Ferrix and I believe in fighting back against the Empire here. And Cassian isn't quite there yet. That he is like, let's get out of here. Start a new life. Basically kind of run away from the problem on Ferrix. But it's not until later on that when he goes to visit Narkina 5 for a very lovely hotel stay. I hear they have a great swimming program there. But
not everyone gets signed up for it.
But that he doesn't become the rebel. He's not there yet, even at the end of season 1. That he's almost at that corner. But then, we see other people working really hard to, do their bits. We see Bix and we see Vel and Cinta, and Nemec writing his manifesto, and, just other people just standing up for each other. Like, Brasso, he is not really a rebel with a capital R. He's just simply sticking up for his family, his the people around him that he considers his family. And I think that's a powerful motivation for a lot of people, is that they are personally affected, that somebody they know is a victim of something that crosses the line, that whether it's violence or incarceration or, just getting ground down, that it becomes a motive. Is like, hey, this now affects me personally. And so that's sometimes what it takes, rather than seeing kind of the big picture and seeing, what, this whole situation is making me mad, but it is like, okay, it's affecting me personally. And some people might not get involved at the big picture, because it's like, well, I have to look after my family. But once it becomes impacting your family, then it's like, okay, yeah, let's get this going.
I think Becca's point is really interesting and really important about Marva's ability to pass on that information, or having a kind of position of historical significance, or at least of wisdom, because it actually mirrors a lot of what's going on in the climate movement at the moment, insofar as a lot of the new kids on the block, let's say, particularly in the UK, for example, XR, Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, and some of them lot. One of the reasons that they're a little bit they create a lot of friction in the movement is because they seem to be saying, oh yeah, we're doing this for the first time, we're the first ones to be causing this disruption, when actually environmental activism has had half a century, if not more, of real intense environmental activism on all sorts of different fronts, including nuclear disarmament, as you mentioned there, Becca, but also animal rights, pollution, CFCs and fridges, all sorts of things. So I really like the fact that they positioned Marva as this sort of oracle, if you like, because that's kind of where some people are sitting in various movements at the moment. And this diversity of people's reasonings, which, you mentioned, James, I think, again, it resonates really well with the different reasonings that you see for people's resistance and rebellion. I think your point, Chris, about the humans and the aliens, it's really important, because there's a sense that the people that are rebelling or have been rebelling for a long time have had their liberties and their life, destroyed by the empire for a long period of time. But there are some who perhaps have only had it destroyed recently, because those are the ones who have built up privilege over the time, have been able to live with the empire, because they're in a position where they're not perhaps as oppressed as other members are. And so this, again, is resonates with what goes on in the real world, insofar as that it's usually the people, the minorities, who will get oppressed first by the empire, and they're the ones that sort of have to rebel the hardest and the longest, and then it gets to that point where it's everyone else. Is it that first they came power? Is it the Nine Moller power? The first they came for the socialists and all that stuff. So there is a sense that all these different people have kind of come into that rebellion at different points, obviously for different reasons, but because there's obviously been a stage sense here where the empire has slowly encroached upon their liberties or their privilege over time, and they've thought, hang on a second, yeah, they are awful, so let's join this rebellion. And that to me is a really great metaphor, if you like, or representation of the ways in which people join rebellions in the real world.
It reminds me a bit of the meme that you often see circulating on social media, like, what radicalized you? Because everyone has a different reason why they join a rebellion. And I think one of the great things about Andor is it gets at the heart of the challenges of working with people, alongside people, and putting trust in people that you don't necessarily like, who have very, very different motivations to you. And I'm sort of thinking of Luthen saying to Saw Gerrera, aren't you sick of fighting people who agree with you? And I think often, like, whether you're involved in an activist movement or you're in a trade union, there's always some trade-off where, depending on whether you're looking in a very micro way, it can feel like you totally disagree with everyone else around you. But from that kind of macro, sort of slightly zoomed out perspective, you are all on the same side, and you just have to get on with it.
With that, let's talk about Luthen. He has this great speech about the personal cost of rebellion. Basically, he's using himself up for a future he won't see, that he's becoming the monster so that other people don't have to be the monster.
And what do you sacrifice?
Calm, kindness, kinship, love, I've given up all chance at inner peace. I made my mind a sunless space. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago from which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, they've set me on a path from which there's no escape. I yearn to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I look down, there's no longer any ground beneath my feet. What is my sacrifice? I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude. So what do I sacrifice? Everything!
I mean, I think this speech is, up there with the Tears and Rain monologue from Blade Runner. I mean, I really do like it, and I've used it a fair bit in my teaching since, I must admit. And I'm always using Star Wars memes, but to use a sort of proper speech like this was great. And it's that bit at the beginning, particularly. I mean, there's lots of other reasons to like it, but where he says, "I'm them to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them." I mean, I'd love to know whether the writers were deliberately riffing on Audre Lorde's essay, the Master's tools never dismantle the Master's house. And Audre Lorde, for those who don't know, is a sort of black civil rights feminist scholar who talks about resistance, but comes at it from the position of a sort of anarcho-feminism, and argues that you can't use the Master's tools to dismantle the Master's house. That is quite a sort of Marxist tradition, insofar as you do take the Master's tools and you kind of create your own army, and then you storm the Master's house and you take it over. That's the kind of classic Marxist theory. And maybe Luthen is that sort of classic Marxist sort of rebel, whereas there's plenty of other examples throughout the rest of those people that we saw on the previous slide, and all the different journeys that are actually more in Audre Lorde's camp, which is actually, no, we by rebel, we save the things we love. Or there's a quote, is it from Jyn Erso in Rogue One? It's not a problem if you don't look up the flag of the Empire. So it's a fantastic quote. And we spent many joyful hours in my class trying to dissecting it.
I've been thinking about that a lot since past week, since we had our initial talk, is this idea of, because we talked about the using the quote, you can't destroy the Master's house with the tools of the Master, but it's like, at what point, I think this is, maybe a little off topic, but I think the writer's strike made me think about, well, what point do you have to, you're left with no other tools, because every tool has been incorporated in one way or another that makes it to the point where you're left kind of in a desperate back against the wall kind of thing. And I don't know about that from a personal perspective. What's so good about the speech is he's so dedicated in the way that he thinks. At the beginning of the speech, he also talks about, like love and calmness, and I've had to give up, a life of peace and all that. But it all comes down to this towards the end of just like kind of the ego he's had to burn, and the ego also that he has to build when he's, in front of people. And it's interesting that, and from his perspective, it is like the only way he's going to be able to affect change is by, just being ruthless for like you said, so that other people don't have to be ruthless after him. It's a very interesting kind of baggage to apply to a character that I think is one of the reasons that his character is so interesting.
What I find interesting about Luthen, and obviously we all remember him from A New Hope, he's going to be fine, all of those scenes that he had in that film and the other ones, is that, drawing on kind of Oli and Jake's points, Luthen is manufacturing and funding kind of a rebel movement against the Empire that already kind of exists. And you can see that he has, from this, again, absolutely amazing monologue, this kind of burning dislike and hatred of the Empire. But it's when he watches Marva in the last episode that I think you get a sense from him of, he sees something that he can't manufacture. He can't buy people or give weapons to people to make them feel these things. This kind of realization from him that if this is going to have legs, it's going to have to come from the grassroots. At some point, someone's going to have to convince people that the Empire is a disease, and that the only reasonable reaction in the face of it is to is to fight it. And I think that you get that little realization of Luthen, firstly, that, oh my God, this is happening. This is happening now. I've been waiting a long time for this. But also other people feel this thing. And I couldn't have lit that fire in Marva, and I couldn't have lit that fire in people. And even if, for some reason it turns out he's not in A New Hope, it doesn't matter, because it spreads. But that feeling that actually he doesn't have to do all of these things. There are some things that he can't do. He can't manufacture this. He can't give guns enough to make this happen. He can't buy it in Saw Gerrera and his merry men, a kind of band of psychopaths. It's going to have to come from somewhere else.
They could always special edition him in, and at some point in A New Hope, he just walks directly in front of the camera and then off to the side, and that's
just says McClunky, and then he's gone.
Yeah, and then he keeps going.
It reminds me of what you were just saying, Chris. I think looking at the language that's being used here, really reminiscent of Holdo's line in The Last Jedi, light the spark that starts the fire that burns the Empire, or the First Order. It's so interesting thinking about that. I mean, Marva is the spark. Right. Marva is a spark. He's not. He's talking about he is being burned. Mm-hmm. And it's that, he's the use of, using the master's tools, using the tools of your enemy. You suffer the same fate that they do. You burn with the Empire. And, that you see that word all through this speech, like talking about burning, light. I'd not really thought about the specificity of the language of it before. But I think that's a kind of useful analogy, at least for me, to think of Marva and Luthen in very different roles.
Marva's the spark, Luthen's the fuel.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was
he's an
thinking
agitator and an instigator. He's poking and prodding throughout the entire season, which leads to some people getting there.
Yeah, he's the kindling, and I don't know. It always struck me that this speech of his that, he talks about, kind of his ego, and it's like he is very egocentric about this, but maybe that's what it takes to push people to that edge. That certainly, working with Saw Gerrera, he's got to be able to stand up for his side. But, we talk about, Luthen, and there's lots of other people who are resisting and in different levels. That you have political leaders, you have just regular citizens, you have even people within the Empire, whether they're in the military or in, like, I think Lieutenant Gorn or Lonnie, who is in the ISB. So what is that like, resisting within a system?
I think it's interesting if we compare Luthen to Mon Mothma, who is also, Mon Mothma is resisting from inside the system. You get loads of fantastic shots of her, making impassioned speeches to a Senate that isn't listening, as a kind of brace yourself, everybody, on the nose metaphor is approaching kind of moment. But Luthen is far more clear-eyed about the realities than Mon Mothma is, and Luthen gives her pretty short shrift at time. This idea that, did you think that at some point we'd have acquired enough money that we just buy the Empire out of fascism? At some point people are gonna, this is going to resort to fisticuffs, kids. But Mon Mothma's resistance comes with its own sacrifices. Her daughter thinks she's a camera chasing PR addict, and she's living at home with what can possibly be charitably be described as the second worst man on Coruscant. Who invites the Emperor's friends to dinner. But she has to maintain this veneer of respectability and the right balance of being annoying without being annoying enough that attention focuses on her. So it's this very weird kind of role that she plays, where she is sacrificing part of herself. She weds her daughter off to a gangster as her sacrifice to the cause.
She's just like every other character we see, is getting more radicalized throughout the season, but has to do it all quietly, which is its own kind of, narrative torture put on her of she's coming to terms with all of these, sacrifices she's going to have to make, just like other folks are, but in a very quietly hostile environment.
I think it's really interesting how one of the ways in which Andor has been praised, for, amongst many different things, but is that it really shows the banality of evil. This Hannah Arendt's ideas that when the philosopher, when she was describing fascism or the Nazis in Germany, she was saying, oh, well, there was, they just sort of went along with it. And we see that in the Empire. We see, I mean, a lot of the mid-level sort of people that we focus on. But actually, it's kind of mirrored a little bit in what Mon Mothma does, insofar as there's almost like a banality of rebellion, insofar as that she has to do these fairly mundane official governmental activities, but at the same time, she knows she's doing them in order to sort of create a resource, a financial resource, to create a structure which can match the Empire. So it is that sort of using the Master's tools or somehow trying to match it in some way. So yeah, there is this sense that there's a sort of banality of rebellion as well as just as much as there's a banality of evil, I guess. And that's what Andor does so well. It just sort of really, it highlights that with just the ways in which you sort of see their daily lives being played out. And, Cyril having that blue milk with his overbearing mother and stuff. It's brilliant. So I think that there's a real sense that that banality is front and center, but it's so vital in Rebellion.
I think maybe we can agree that Cyril's mom may be the most evil person on Coruscant. But no, definitely that the banality of it is like, just having to set up fundings and like, okay, we got to, figure out what to do some creative accounting. But then, it comes down to that her daughter becomes sort of the Iphigenia here of starting this war, she has to sacrifice her own daughter to, kind of gain the favor to keep the momentum going. And that's something that maybe we don't see other people that are resisting rebellion. I guess Lonnie, in a sense, he's sacrificing his ability to be with his family in order to stay in the ISB to keep feeding people information, and he's sacrificing a bit of his own soul, knowing that Anto Krieger's entire group is getting wiped out just to keep him as a mole inside the ISB. Okay, let's move on to talk about kind of individual acts of rebellion. We see people, starting to organize, but, at the basic level, you have just people on their own kind of starting what they want to do. We have example of that of Wilman Pack. His father gets hauled off by the Empire and tortured and killed. And so he decides, what, I'm going to start building a bomb. So what is that at kind of the individual level?
I mean, I think it plays back into what we said earlier, and so everyone has their own justifications or their own reasonings for joining the rebellion. Bomb making is classic, French Revolution style. There's lots of individual sort of homemade bombs and homemade weapons, and we don't really see the origins and sources of the stuff that he's using, but he may well have actually sourced it from Empire technology. So, I think that as a whole, though, it evidences the different justifications, and actually it's almost like death by a thousand cuts. You need these individuals to perform these little acts of rebellion in order to puncture holes and to test the defenses, if you like, of the Empire's defenses. So it really highlights how the nuances and the everyday activities of large scale rebellion. I think that it's what was missing from the original trilogy, I guess, is that we kind of joined it halfway through. We joined it. Oh yeah, well, they just have all these TIE fighters and they have all these amazing X-wings and planes and everything else, but we never really get a sense of like, well, what been motivating people to get to that point. And so we see it here. We see it, people lose their family, people lose their friends, people lose their mothers, and that is the reason why we have that in the original film. So yeah, it all tells that journey of how that mass of rebellion all came together.
I was going to say, on the subject of individual acts of rebellion, I appreciate he's working with Cassian, but I think it's worth mentioning Kino Loy, because that for me was one of the most moving moments in the whole series. I know that everyone kind of talks about the big monologues, but that simple sentence, "I can't swim," it got me right in the feels. The journey that he goes on and the individual sacrifice that he's willing to make for a future that he has no hope for as an individual, and can't really know what is in store for anyone else, because they get to the sort of edge of the platform of the prison and no one knows that they're going to survive. You're running entirely on hope at that point, a wing and a prayer. And yeah, I just think that that's a really fascinating character arc from where we see him when Cassian first ends up imprisoned, and he's quite kind of built into the system and just wants to do his time and get everyone else through their time and leave, to becoming someone who has to shoulder the burden of being a leader and leading others to something that he isn't going to be able to experience himself.
My name is Kino Loy. I'm the day shift manager on level 5. I'm speaking to you from the command center on level 8. We are, at this moment, in control of the facility.
Is that the best you got?
How long we hang on, how far we get, how many of us make it out, all of that is now up to us. We have deactivated every floor in the facility. All the floors are cold. Wherever you are, right now, get up. Stop the work. Get out of your cells. Take charge and start climbing. They don't have enough guards, and they know it. If we wait until they figure that out, it'll be too late. We will never have a better chance than this. And I would rather die trying to take them down than giving them what they want. We know they fried 100 men on level 2. We know that they are making up our sentences as we go along. We know that no one outside here knows what's happening. And now we know that when they say we are being released, we are being transferred to some other prison to go and die. And that ends today. There is one way out. Right now. The building is ours. You need to run, climb, kill. You need to help each other. You see someone who's confused, someone who's lost. You get them moving and you keep them moving until we put this place behind us. There are 5,000 of us. If we can fight half as hard as we've been working, we will be home in no time. One way out! 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 One
I got to see Andy Serkis this past week at a screening of Andor, just the Narkina 5 episodes up in Burbank. And he described that he believed Kino Loy to be basically like a union organizer. And so his crime was basically just being a leader in a time when the Empire wanted a monopoly on leaders. And so he got put into the prison for that. And then, what does he end up doing? He becomes a leader again. And as you mentioned, he's just there to kind of get through his sentence, keep his head down, make sure, people get through alive. But yeah, that once he realizes there's no hope for anybody there, that, none of them are getting out, that's, immediately he just turns on this switch that, Cassian asks him before, how many guards are on each level? And he's like, no, not telling you nothing. And then as soon as that switch flips, he's like immediately 12. Like he knows everything, but he's been keeping his head down this whole time.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of him being a trade union organizer outside Narkino 5 is, well, it resonates because a lot of us participating in this panel work in a sector where union activists are constantly being targeted by their employers and ostracized or made redundant. So, yeah, I mean, there's just so many real world parallels with the sort of political situation we find ourselves in at the moment and what's happening in Andor.
Yeah, well, going back, I think it's what's so great about, folks, building a bomb in a shed with the tools that they've got or using your leadership in that way is everybody's got a set of tools, whether it's their own character or their own, something is available to them. And so seeing these acts of resistance that spring out of what each individual is capable of accomplishing, that all kind of goes towards what we know to become the entirety of the rebellion, seeing these individual things, these individual strengths, is I think a great part of Andor. And it's so interesting how, those first episodes with Kino Loy, when Andor first gets there, it's like he has got all the confidence in the world. This is how it works. You go over here, you do this, you're competing with them, and I'm competing with, every other floor. Kind of this rehearsed speech or whatever. And then when it comes time for him to be on the comms and he doesn't have that, stump speech or, the rehearsed, this is how I talk to my prisoners kind of thing. It takes Andor being there, being like, is that the best you got, man? Like but it ignites something in him, and he is able to step up to the plate and make it work. But you can see turning in his head, using his leadership skills, but having to reconfigure the cogs a little bit to make it work for this new situation. And I Andy Serkis is so great that it's all on the screen there.
Find it interesting the extent to which the Empire both copes very well and massively struggles with predictability and unpredictability. So, you get the funeral of Ferrix and the Empire's like, oh, this could be an issue. So we'll make sure we've all, lots of stormtroopers and the like. And we also, it's reasonably predictable that Cassian, if he's ever going to come back to Ferrix, it'll be now. So we're ready for this. But a massive blind spot about the idea that, a son might have a problem with you just dragging his father off the street and torturing him to death, that might cause a problem further down the line. And it's these kind of competing clarity and blind spots that cause issues for the Empire. There's a bit in a conversation between Cassian and Kino Loy where Cassian, after finding out that they iced everybody on level whatever it was, and Cassian says, power doesn't panic. And the Empire is always riding the very edge of panic. It's partly because they're trying to do everything as to the lowest bidder, effectively, the minimum number of guards, the minimum number of stormtroopers and like. But they massively struggle with unpredictability, or what they conceive of being unpredictable, to the point where anything that deviates from what they expect to happen, it's such a heavy-handed response, which turns out to be exactly what Luthen wants. He wants the Empire to be brutal. He wants the Empire to crack down. He wants the unpredictability of the Alliance to radicalize the Empire as much as he needs the Empire to radicalize every rebel cell across the galaxy.
Yeah, and there's also, I think, an ego of scale, right? Where it's and that kind of comes down to everybody's job being compartmentalized and the banality of evil. But it's like this idea that something so big, how could one proton torpedo and one, exhaust port lead to anything? And so they shoot that down immediately. Why shoot at the escape pod that doesn't have any life forms on board? Well, you've shot every other one down. And it's those little decisions that, it sounds kind of nitpicky when you put them like that, but it all does kind of work into the narrative of like what you're talking about, where they're just kind of, with a scale of something that large comes little kind of exploitable moments like that, I guess.
We talked a little bit earlier about having kind of this death by 1,000 cuts, and that ties right into Nemik's manifesto. Let's tackle that. Let's talk about what Nemik has to say.
There will be times when the struggle seems impossible. I know this already. Alone, unsure, dwarfed by the scale of the enemy. Remember this: freedom is a pure idea. It occurs spontaneously and without instruction. Random acts of insurrection are occurring constantly throughout the galaxy. There are whole armies, battalions that have no idea that they've already enlisted in the cause. Remember that the frontier of the rebellion is everywhere, and even the smallest act of insurrection pushes our lines forward. And then remember this: the Imperial need for control is so desperate because it is so unnatural. Tyranny requires constant effort. It breaks. It leaks. Authority is brittle. Oppression is the mask of fear. Remember that. And know this: the day will come when all these skirmishes and battles, these moments of defiance, will have flooded the banks of the Empire's authority, and then there will be one too many. One single thing will break the siege. Remember this. Try.
I mean, it almost feels like it goes without saying that the Jedi Order is questionable in regards to their ethics, morality, approach to serious problems. But Nemik's wording is directly opposed to Yoda. Yoda says you either do something or you don't. The minute you try is the minute you fail. And Nemik's saying there is a value in trying. There is a value in attempting to do these things and being seen to attempt to do these things, that whilst one individual may not provide the absolute kind of clarity or the moment of change, that person may be the rebel that breaks the empire's back. It's a rising tide of individuals, and that the way that you overwhelm the empire is by just all of this stuff day after day, tiny little acts of resistance or bigger acts of rebellion over and over and over again. And even if it's not going to work, you try, because it annoys the empire and it uses up resistance and it uses up resources and it inspires other people to do things, whether that's jaywalking or hitting a fascist with a brick. They all add together to a collective worth. Whereas Yoda's you either do it or you don't. Well, Nemik is not going to bring down the empire by himself. It just isn't going to happen. I don't care about him as a person. I don't care about his flowery words. As an individual, he is not going to do this by himself. So Yoda tells us that he shouldn't bother. Whereas Nemik clearly says, actually, just giving it a go is worth it enough. So, on a sliding scale of, rebel hero versus trash, we've got, Nemik on one side and potentially Yoda on the other, ?
Well, no. Yoda was telling Luke what he needed to hear right in that moment, because Luke had was consumed by self-doubt. And I think if Nemik had been there, he might have pushed Luke into the same, outcome ultimately. It's interesting. I really liked what you said about people seeing you try, because that can be that all comes down to our wider discussion of sparks and the just that little bit of friction that causes something larger. That is true. But then we could dive into that's kind of what Luke ends up being really good at doing in The Last Jedi, is being out in front of everybody and facing down the first. But anyway, we don't have to dive into that more. But it's interesting how different things push people in different directions, for sure.
So yeah, I think there's quite a lot to unpick with this speech, which is really beautiful in lots of ways. But the idea that tyranny requires constant effort. For anyone who's been involved in any kind of activism knows that so does freedom. Freedom requires constant effort too. It's not a zero-sum game. It isn't a pure idea. Freedom means different things to different people, in the same way that, your motivation for fighting the Empire or the First Order is going to be down to your individual circumstances. So this is what Cassian needs to hear. And this is what Nemik needs to believe, as much as it is a manifesto for real change. But one of the things that we talked about at Celebration, which I think it's worth raising again, is the tension between almost the purity of what Nemik's saying here and the context in which we're hearing these words, which is through Andor, via Star Wars, via Lucasfilm, through the Disney Corporation. And, we can't separate the words that we're hearing and the ideas that we're currently talking about from their real world context, which is that, it's a metaphor I used the other day. We, as Star Wars fans, are the gamblers in the casino on Canto Bight. Like, we're enjoying the spoils. We're having a great time at the party. But the fact is that party was made by an exploitative corporation. And there are plenty of people around the world who have never seen Star Wars, probably aren't interested in it, and have been actively harmed by its production. Indigenous communities in Guatemala, the many people who work in factories that create the, bits of machinery that go into servers. We know that there are tons and tons and tons of exploited workers across the African continent working in digital tech industries, which serve film and television. And there is a huge environmental cost of any kind of film and television making on this scale. So there's a part of me that feels like we have to grapple with that, and we can't overlook it. Especially as I think Andor has done a really great job of inspiring people to a point. And, the politics of this show have been unlike any other Star Wars thing I've seen. It's really speaking to us at a moment of, all moments are about change historically. There's always conflict. But right now, let's say things have been quite bad for quite a lot of people. And there's so many real world examples of racism, transphobia, homophobia, misogyny, that in both US and UK contexts that we could speak to. And so this really taps into something. And I think Tony Gilroy and everyone else working on the show has obviously got something to say about those issues. And it's coming through in various metaphors. But what we're not doing is going out and changing the world as a result of that. And so it just feels like sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect between these, inspiring words in a fictional manifesto. And where do people take that? What do they do with it? I kind of want to see Star Wars tell people what to do a bit more, like explain to people how to go and do something to change their circumstances. So yeah, for me, this encapsulates quite a lot of those tensions and challenges, shall we say.
It's a really good point, and one which I think has been grappled with by all sorts of social scientists and philosophers and sort of people over the last few decades, at least, because corporations do, to some extent at least, and even more so now, perform a lot of our resistance for us. You look at what Disney, aren't they suing DeSantis in Florida now? And and I guess there's a couple of things going on here. The first is because a lot of our governments, the US government, the UK government, and many European governments elsewhere have shifted so far to the right that a lot of the corporations, which obviously are hegemonic and unsustainable and do all those nasty things which you mentioned there, but they are sort of slightly further to the center perhaps, and so they're beginning to push back a little bit. But that has always been part of consumer capitalism, insofar as there's always going to be a tension between getting a voice heard, because the makers of this program probably have very similar sentiments to us or to other sort of activists. They probably want to see the world change. They just happen to be very, very good story writers and script editors and cinematographers and whatever it is. So they're working for a corporation which they think will get their voice heard or get their message heard over the the noise of the incoming money and capital. And that's a decision that many artists have across, the small artists taking a commission from BP to do whatever, or art washing a building, whatever it is. These decisions are made across the world daily with the intention that, yes, maybe at some point I might change someone's mind. And you mentioned the fact that there's these Star Wars fans are not changing the world. I don't know. I think we have to play the long game with this, because Rome wasn't built in a day. And you look at the views and the political views of young people around the world now. It is radically, there some survey that Fox News pulled out that like 75% in under 25 are all socialists or something. So, I don't think it's an accident that a lot of these popular culture consumers, and there's always going to be the vocal minority of the sort of far right kind of like really horrible people. But I suspect that, and maybe this is just the hopefulness in me, but there's a groundswell of real. And it is in the youth, and Greta Thunberg and everyone else, kind of other sort of people that you can kind of point to. And they've consumed Star Wars, and they've consumed all these quite subversive narratives that are, yes, couched in corporations, but they're feeding into their politics and they're feeding into their activism. And I think that it's manifesting in a groundswell of sort of resistance activism to what are increasingly far-right governments. As I say, maybe I'm being naive and too hopeful, but I think that tension there is something that we've lived with for a long time, but it can make a difference.
I agree with Oli here that, we are kind of raising a new generation with these, subversive messages and just trying to recognize that overthrowing evil. It's like we have, our Star Wars hero, we have Nemec here, but we also have like Katniss Everdeen, and we have Harry Potter. They're all standing up against oppression, that they're fighting in their own way. And I know one of the ways that the Empire is hitting us with the banality of evil is that they're just doing it every day, that there's a new outrage every day. And it's, as Becca said, that freedom takes work. And so you have to be fighting it every day. And that's really hard when there's a new low being hit every day. And it's just like, you get tired that you have, protests, you have things like the March for Science, the March for Women, and then you have to go back to work, and it's like there's a new low, and you're just like, I got to keep fighting, but also I got to put food on the table, I got to do laundry. And you mentioned those women that camped outside Greenham Common, and it's like, yeah, that is giving up a lot, that to be there and keep fighting every day, because that means other things aren't getting done. And so that's the challenge of fighting oppression, is that when they are able to sustain this shock and awe of evil, how do we manage to sustain our resistance, especially once we get exhausted?
Sorry, I just wanted to sort of speak back to Oli's point. I was certainly not saying that no Star Wars fans do activism. That wasn't what I was saying. But I think we do also have to be cautious about quite a lot of these arguments. I mean, I was at the Andor panel, and you could see Diego Luna self-censoring. He was talking about Narkina 5 and there being real-world context for that. And of course, he's referring to the prison industrial complex and what is mostly the incarceration of men of color in the US, particularly black men. But he couldn't actually explicitly say that. And you know that he can't explicitly say that because of the corporate PR machine around him. So if you can't say those things out loud and you're being censored by your employer, where does that leave you in terms of it being a centrist or more to the center organization? That doesn't seem very center to me. And I am optimistic, there's a new generation, but I think we have to be careful about not doing what certain activists do and claiming that this is all new. Because, of course, an earlier generation, they had Luke and Leia and Han. This is not the first representation of activism. It's not the first representation of rebellion. This has happened over and over and over again. And, having been in classrooms as a queer woman, I can tell you the younger generation are not all about progressive politics. They're really not. So I think we just have to be, again, it's tension, it's things pulling in different directions. I would like to see Star Wars really nail its colors to the mast is I think where I will leave that.
I just wanted to chime in. I saw that on MSNBC, Mehdi Hassan had done a 30 minutes Politics of Andor thing for May the 4th. And so I knew this was coming up, so I watched it. So I recommend y'all check it out, just maybe for context what I'm about to say. But he had a panel on there that was, and one of, I forgot from what publication he's from, but he was talking about how Andor has kind of proved to be a Rorschach test for a lot of folks. And that, there are some, because we're talking about how outright political this show is and how the messages are right there. And how can anybody ignore these anti-fascist, anti-authoritarian, things? And I think a lot of that has to come down to media literacy to a certain extent. But what the panel was kind of talking about is, for some people, this has been, who do you see as the oppressor? Who do you see, in your real world as who's being occupied and everything? But also there are some people who watch Andor and take away, I'm Cassian, and vaccine mandates and woke politics are the empire. And I have to work as hard as possible to make sure woke doesn't come to my town and things like that. And so some people, that's kind of what's always been. And Chris, knows this more than anybody here. I'm sure he wrote the book on it. But there's always been that Rorschach test element of Star Wars politics. You can always kind of apply the empire. If George Lucas says it's Richard Nixon is the emperor and the rebellion are the Viet Cong, that only goes so far. There's always going to be people who see their own political alignment with the rebellion. And also, startlingly, there's always going to be people who are okay with the empire and want to be Darth Vader or think that that's where the actual, power is. Becca brought up a great point talking about the Disney Corporation itself, because right now we have the, the writer's strike going on right now, but Disney outright said they will press legal action against any showrunners who don't report to set for production because their producer contracts state that they still need to be there. And so Andor is the show on the slate right now. And Tony Gilroy said he wrote as quickly as possible to get the season finished before the strike hit. But now Disney's saying that he has to be there on set as part of his obligation as a producer for the show. And where's that line going to show up? We're going to find that out here in the not too distant future. But they've said that, every showrunner needs to be there and they'll press legal action. I mean, that could be a bluff, but it's just like, it's so it's almost too on the nose that this show is going to be maybe kind of a canary in the coal mine for what we're going to see over the next couple of months in the writer's strike and just how far maybe these production studios are going to be willing to go. And it's impossible to ignore that. I know we won't ignore it just because, we're here right now and we like spending hours talking about Star Wars at this point. But it's really interesting because it just puts so much into perspective of how much this show is using the massive commodification of art as a means to tell its story. And and it comes down to something we talked about in the panel of what's the difference between telling stories like this and also outright calling for, are we supposed to just vicariously be rebellious through these characters, or are we supposed to be rebellious, inspired by these characters? And that comes down to a lot of what Becca was talking about. But yeah, that's just kind of a lot of scraps of thoughts I've put together listening here in the last 10 minutes.
The irony that a show so dedicated to rebellion is threatening legal action against its own rebels. I mean, it says a lot, but the point as well about how do people see their own politics? And this came up the other day. It comes up every May 4th. It's a recurring conversation. One of the first examples that we know about of May the 4th being used as a means of referring to the date comes from a Conservative Party political ad in the London Evening News that says, Maggie, May the 4th be with you, because it was the date of the 1980 election, which Margaret Thatcher won. It happened, or was it 79? It might have been 79. It's 79, isn't it? Yeah, it's during the production of The Empire Strikes Back, which amuses me greatly. But this is, I mean, these are films about rebels and rebel fighters standing up to an authoritarian, seemingly quite right-wing brand of fascism. And yet the Conservative Party, led by Margaret Thatcher in the UK, has co-opted that and is using it as if they are the rebels. And you can see it so clearly in the character, we haven't mentioned her yet, in Deidre Miro, who absolutely thinks that she is on the right side of history. She thinks that she is doing the right thing. And I would really like to see a deeper dive into her and her backstory in series 2, because what radicalized Deidre Miro? Where does she come from? How does she get to that headspace where she is convinced that she is doing the right thing?
I hope it's something really banal like potholes or collection dates or something like that have driven her into the waiting arms.
Those pesky rebels keep putting holes in the roads at the space lanes, and we just want to fill them in. And the Empire is just all about we just want to keep the roads smooth, the space trains running on time, just have this nice order.
No choice but to be a space Nazi.
Yeah. So one of the aspects of Andor is their representation of kind of the military industrial complex. We have that corporation at the beginning. Let's talk about that.
I thought that was a great way to introduce the Empire, particularly in Andor, given that, there's a sense that a lot of the, I guess, outright bad politics, fascist politics of the United States is centered around their use of corporations and their use of private money, specifically in the military, teaming up with arms dealers and arms producers companies to wage war in the Middle East and everything else. And so the fact that they pivoted that front and center, I thought was a really quite an interesting way to introduce that. And they were able to show how it was the different motivations as well, like one being profit, one being control. And we see it with the prison as well. I think that's the prison is clearly a similar sort of setup with the evidencing the prison industrial complex. Because if we've seen the end credits scene at the end, we clearly know that robots can build the Death Star, yet they are using people to do it as a sort of means of control, which is as a means of sort of suppressing particular groups of people, which is clearly what the prison industrial complex is designed to do, as Becca outlined earlier so well. So I don't think it's an accident that these networks and connections are made, because how else are you going to, an empire to govern a galaxy? You're going to need little companies or big companies, I guess, to manage that planet, to do this thing, to sort of all the different various things. Because I guess at that point, the Empire isn't quite as far-reaching as perhaps it is in A New Hope. So, yeah, it's along with the banality of evil thing, it's a really, I think, a deliberate characteristic that they've put in there to evidence the different sort of characteristics of Empire.
I like the hierarchical nature of it, where you have these companies who will do exactly what the Empire would have done themselves if they'd come down there, but will do it to avoid the Empire coming down there. So the Empire has outsourced tyranny to a variety of kind of placeholder corporations who will be just as tyrannical, just as unpleasant as the Empire would be. But the Empire exists as like the guy upstairs. It's like, oh, do you want to have a strike? Do you want to cause? Because I'm gonna have to go and ask the guy upstairs, and then he's gonna come down, and he's gonna bring his stormtroopers with him, and then there's gonna be TIE fighters, and then you see where after the heist, like the Star Destroyer arrives. It's like the only time we see a Star Destroyer is, oh, you annoyed us enough that now we've had to go and we've sent this upstairs, and now they're going to come down here, and you end up with this hierarchical nature, which is fascinating, but very kind of East India Company in its own way.
I think it does a great job, perhaps not so much as the sequel films do, mostly through Finn's character, but you do get a sense of the brutality of recruitment into the military as well, and into those corporate spaces. I think the moment where Cassian and Kino Loy storm the headquarters of the prison guards, and it's this real Wizard of Oz pulling back the curtain moment. I mean, even to the point of it being a vocal trick where the kind of big booming voice that you hear through the complex is essentially a fancy vocoder. And you've got these two basically kids who don't know what they're doing and don't want to die and are faced with people with far more experience handling weapons and leading than they have. They're not leaders. They are barely not teenagers anymore. And I think it's played with a degree of humor. I don't think I ever quite got to feeling really sorry for them, but it's definitely going in that direction. And you see the power imbalances and the fact that there will be people fighting for the Empire who have not made an active choice to do that. They've been co-opted into it. They've been pulled into it, but it maybe isn't something that they would actively have chosen for themselves.
Or even if they did actively choose it for themselves, it might be for, reasons that made sense to them, but then maybe later on, it's like, oh, wait, I can't get out. Like, it's like, I live on a really crappy planet. This is my chance to get off world and away from the crap fest. And so I get to go be a soldier and a stormtrooper. And it's like, oh, wow, now I am providing the crap fest for somebody else. And, that's where we get things kind of like Finn. Obviously he got recruited, conscripted as a child. But, we see that, in lots of places that people are like, this is not what I signed up for. Or people are like, no, this is what I signed up for. And I get off on having the ability to have power and oppress.
I mean, lest we forget, isn't that Luke's plan to escape the banality of life on the moisture farm? He wants to, yeah.
Well, I think that wraps up our recreation of the Andor panel that we had at Celebration. Do we have any final thoughts from anyone? You can give your final thought and maybe also a place where people can find you online or any projects that you have coming up that you want to share.
So if people want to find me after the podcast, they can look up my Twitter account, which is Becca E. Harrison, or you can find me via my website, which is writingonreels.uk, and that has contact details and a list of all of the publications, videos, and various other sort of Star Wars-y things that I've been involved in.
Yeah, if you want to find out where I am, you just type Oli Mould into Google, OLIMOULD. I'm on Twitter, although I've kind of escaped that now. I'm on Mastodon, but yeah, TikTok and other things as well. So yeah, just have a look at that. There is lots of pan Star Wars content, which is completely over-egged, but it's all good fun.
If you're looking for me, I'm on Twitter at Jake Rowlett. Rowlett, all lowercase or whatever. I don't know how Twitter works. I'm trying to tweet more. I'm not very good at it, but I'm trying to get better at it. I've got some cool stuff coming down the line that is Star Wars adjacent that I'm excited to share with folks when that comes up. So yeah, I'll try and get better at that. My maybe concluding thought that I'd like to share is that I am fully in support of the writer's strike and everything that they're asking for from these studios. And even if that is at odds with, my fandom wants of as much Star Wars as possible, who cares if it's not made with everybody getting a fair shake? So yeah, I don't really want to see even Andor go into production without Tony Gilroy there on the set. So we'll see how that all shakes out. But yeah. I'll take the future of Star Wars when I can get it, if it comes as fairly as possible.
Yeah,
I would second that.
So in regards to finding me, one of the benefits of being the only Chris Kempshall who's ever existed means that all of my social media handles are real easy to find, depending on how you spell Kempshall, which, appears to vary from student to student and bank to bank. But at Chris Kempshall on Twitter is for anything fun that comes up. Kind of closing thoughts. I mean, just effectively how kind of enjoyable this is. It was enjoyable at Celebration. It was enjoyable now. Yeah, just, thanks very much for having us along.
Well, thank you, everyone. Oli, Chris, Jake, Becca, and Manuel in absentia. I just wanted to wrap up. Thank you all, and wrap up with the last bit of Marva's speech. If I could do it again, I'd wake up early and be fighting these bastards from the start. Fight the Empire, or whatever F word that the actress wanted to say. We love Fiona Shaw.
Oh, so much. That wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank all of the panelists for joining us again, and we want to thank Jack Eddy for becoming a listener and providing us with some great feedback, and all of you, of course, for listening. If you're looking for the links we might have talked about during the show, or you want to see the show notes, we have that on skywalkingthroughneverland.com/star-warsologies. And also check out our YouTube channel, and there's some of the visuals there, as we mentioned.
If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Twitter and Instagram, or at starwarsologies@gmail.com. That is StarWarsologies. We also have a fan group on Facebook. It's called Star Warsologies Podcast Fan Group, so you can come in there, chat with us and your fellow listeners. Please also rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service, and definitely share with your friends.
No topic is off limits. Even figuring out how the binary language of evaporators is different from the binary language of load lifters.
We are part of the Skywalking Network, where you can also find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel, including the Neverland Clubhouse and the flagship show, Skywalking Through Neverland. There's also a YouTube show, Today in Star Wars Histories. You can find all of these at skywalkingnetwork.com.
See you next time on Star Warsologies.